Hey bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you my November reading wrap-up. In the month of November, I read a total of 6 books. Well, I read 5 books and I DNF'd 1 book. And quantity-wise, I'm really happy with that. Rating-wise, it was kind of a mediocre month for me. I ended up with 2 2-stars, 1 3-star, 1 4-star, and 2 5-stars. So kind of like an even spread. Out of these 6 books, 2 of them were actually part of a series, but only one of them really counts because one of them was the first book in a series that was a reread. I don't really plan to reread the sequel, so even though it was the first book in a series, it doesn't get added to the total number of series that I'm currently reading. And then the other series book that I read was actually a series ender, so that was fantastic. In my monthly wrap-ups, I always talk about the books that I read in the order that I read them, and the books that I read this month were If You See Her by Ania Ahlborn, Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, The Secret Scripture by Sebastian. This was actually my DNF, so I didn't technically read it. Hex by Olde Heuvelt, Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, which is the first book in the Strange the Dreamer duology, and Assassin's Quest by Hobb, which is the third and final book in the Farseer trilogy. As always, I will have timestamps in the description box so that you can jump to whichever of these books you are most interested in hearing about. But if you want to hear my thoughts on these books, then stay tuned. Hey guys, it's Jade. So even though the month is more than halfway over, I thought I should check in with the first 3 books that I finished reading in November and 1 book that I decided to DNF. The one readathon to rule them all has just started, so I wanted to go over these books before I got too far into the readathon. The first book that I finished in November was If You See Her by Ania Ahlborn, which was a leftover book from October. It was one I had tried to finish before October was over and just didn't quite fit it in. And I accessed this book through Kindle Unlimited. This is an adult horror book that I gave 3 out of 5 stars. It was my second Ania Ahlborn. I had previously read a novella by her, but I wanted to read one of her full-length novels because I thought that I might enjoy it more because she's known for her really character-driven stories. And I thought that with the novella, I just didn't have enough time to get to know the characters, and that it might have been more impactful if I had spent more time with them. So I was hoping that a full-length novel from her would work better for me. And unfortunately, it didn't. I just found this book to be pretty boring, honestly. The story is about a man named Jesse. At the beginning of the book, him and 2 of his friends go to a house that is reportedly haunted in their town, and one of the 3 friends commits suicide while they're there. Then you fast forward 20 years later, and Jesse's other friend approaches him and asks Jesse to go with him back to this house where their friend committed suicide because he needed a little more closure, and things kind of go on from there. I honestly don't have a whole lot to say about this book other than I found it kind of boring and not really scary. The paranormal element to it definitely felt like it took a long time to get going, and there was just a lot of time just spent in Jesse's head. While at first glance this seems kind of like a haunted house story, it's really more of like a possession or haunted person story. The main character, Jesse, is trying to better his life for him and his family, and all of a sudden things in his life are changing and he's trying to juggle a lot of things, and he slowly starts to fall apart. And that part was interesting to see his dynamics with his wife and his co-workers. He's definitely a character that has a lot of depth, and I can see why Ania Ahlborn is known for her characters. There were a lot of things that I thought were well done. The ending, while I didn't love it, I also thought it was pretty satisfying and pretty good for a horror ending. But overall, I just didn't see anything all that special, and it didn't really make me feel all that special. It was just an okay average book, and that's why I gave it 3 stars. I do think I am open to trying another Ania Ahlborn, but I'm starting to think that maybe she's just not the horror author for me. So if you have read any more of her works, let me know what your favorite Ania Ahlborn is so I know where to go next. The next book that I finished in November was The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, which I listened to on audiobook through the app Scribd, and I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. This book wasn't really, whoops, my camera battery died. So this book wasn't really on my radar at all. I mean, I'd heard of it. It was on that radar, but it wasn't on my fall TBR. I hadn't really planned on reading it so soon, but my friend Murphy from Murphy Napier was reading it in November, and we decided to do a buddy read, which was so much fun because this was a really fun book. I had never read a Ruth Ware before, but I've heard about a lot of her books and I've been interested in a lot of them, and this is her newest, buzziest book. This is supposed to be inspired by The Turn of the Screw, which is not a story that I have read before. But the premise of this sounded so intriguing. It's about a babysitter that takes a nanny job at this really creepy house that is like in the middle of nowhere, kind of isolated. It's an old house, but the owners of the house are architects and have totally revamped it and modernized it. There are cameras everywhere, everything's like voice activated, or you can use an app and things like that. The nanny takes this job, but she's told that the last 3 nannies have left because they thought the house was haunted. And at the beginning of the book, we find out that one of the kids has died, and this nanny is currently in jail or prison. The way the story is told is that she is writing a letter to someone that she wants to be her lawyer and is telling the lawyer everything that happened to her while she was with these kids and trying to explain why she's not guilty. I just had so much fun reading this book. I listened to it on audio, and the narrator was fantastic. I was a little unsure when I was going into it because the narrator has a British accent, I think. I'm terrible at recognizing accents, but a lot of times when an audiobook has a strong accent, it can be hard for me to listen to. It just takes me a little more brain power to process what they're saying, and I was a little nervous that I wasn't going to be able to listen to this on audiobook and I couldn't access it any other way, at least not in time to buddy read it with Murphy because this is a new release. But luckily, after listening to it for like 30 minutes, I got really used to the accent and the audiobook was no problem, and I thought the narrator was great. There are just so many things about the story that were so intriguing. The whole time there are like really weird things happening, and I thought that Ruth Ware did a really great job at giving you plausible explanations for things that were going on, but you just really never knew what was happening. Another thing I really liked is that you don't find out which of the kids has died until the end of the book. So the whole time you're reading, you know one of these kids she's looking after is dead, but you don't know which one. And I just kept wondering while I was reading which of them was gonna die. I thought this book had the perfect mix of mystery and creepy things and romance. And I really loved the way that it ended. I wasn't sure how things were going to be wrapped up, considering the way that the story is told. I was a little worried we weren't going to be able to know what actually happened and if all of my questions were going to be answered. But in the end, I really enjoyed the way the book ended and I found it pretty satisfactory. I really enjoyed my first Ruth Ware, and I'm looking forward to reading more of her books in the future. My next book of November was a DNF, which means I chose not to finish it, and that was The Secret Scripture by Sebastian. This is an adult historical fiction book, which I had gotten out from my library in physical form as well as on audiobook. I decided to give this book 2 stars. I toyed with the idea of giving it 1 just because I really didn't like it and couldn't get into it, but I don't know. I try to reserve 1 stars for books that I have like really, really strong feelings about, like things that make me angry or books that I find offensive, which doesn't happen very often. So I went ahead and gave this book 2 stars. I got about 100 pages into this book, mostly while listening to the audiobook, and found that I was just bored out of my mind. The reason I was reading this was for my workbook club. I hadn't heard of this book prior to it being nominated for a workbook club, and it was not something that had been on my radar. The story is set in Ireland, and it is about an old woman who lives in a mental hospital there, and it's told in journal entries from her, and she talks about her past, like growing up, but it's also told in journal entries from her doctor. I honestly don't have a lot to say about this book either, just that I was really bored, and after 100 pages, I didn't think that that was going to change very much, and there were a few other things that I wanted to get to that I decided not to participate this time in our workbook club, and I decided not to finish this book. And then the last book that I'm going to talk about in this clip is another leftover from October, and that is Hex. by Thomas Olde Heuvelt, which I also gave 2 out of 5 stars. This is an adult horror book. It is a work of translated fiction. The original book was written in Dutch, and I, of course, read the English version, which is important because the English version actually has a different ending than the Dutch version. This is a really bizarre little story, and it was one that I have heard a lot about in the horror community, so I was excited to read it. I feel like it's one that a lot of people have read, and so I wanted to give it a try and see what I thought. I had heard before going into it that it's kind of a strange book, and that's not a lie. It is probably one of the weirdest books I've ever read. So Hex is a story about a small town in the New England area, and this town has a long history, and in its history, the town had killed a person accused of being a witch, and now the town is haunted by this witch. And it's partly about how the town has adapted their lives to not only accommodate this witch ghost that is haunting their town, but also to keep this secret from the rest of the world. There are cameras all over town and outside of people's houses, so they always know where this witch is because she just like kind of pops in and out of anywhere. And then there's also like an app that they use to update where the witch is so that everybody in town knows. And there's even a group of people whose job it is to make sure that the outside world doesn't find out about this witch. Another way that this town is haunted is that once you move to this town, you're stuck there. You can't leave because anytime you leave the town for an extended period of time, you start to hallucinate and get suicidal thoughts, and basically the witch makes you commit suicide unless you come back to town. So people in this community are also always trying to discourage people from moving in, except they can't exactly explain why. I found the first half of the book really intriguing and interesting, but then in the second half of the book is when things start to get kind of weird, and then after a certain point things go kind of crazy, and I don't know, was a little surreal to read. And I just didn't really like the way that it ended. I had heard that it had like a really weird, crazy ending, so I was prepared for it, but being prepared didn't help me to enjoy it any more than I did. I really like the idea behind this book, the idea that there's this creepy witch that pops up all over the town. I love the technology aspect with the cameras and the apps, and one of the main characters is a teenager with a YouTube channel. So I liked how the technology was incorporated into the story, and the idea for this witch is so unique. While things do get a little creepy at the end, for most of the book, the town people are just so used to this witch that you don't feel like she is scary. I don't know. I don't have much more to say about it. I just thought it was okay. For the first half of the book, it was like a 3-star book in the first half, and then in the second half, things get really weird, and I just didn't like it. And the second half was a 2-star book, which comes out to like a 2.5 star that I rounded down to 2, because in the end, I just didn't really enjoy my reading experience. And honestly, I read this book over like a month, because I was having a hard time getting through it. I probably should have just DNF'd it, but knowing that it had some weird, crazy ending that people talk about, I wanted to see for myself what the ending was going to be. In the end though, I definitely don't really recommend this book unless you're really into horror as a genre and want to see something new and different. Alright guys, those are my thoughts on the first 4 books that I read or DNF'd in the month of November. My next check-in will be with all of the books that I read for the one readathon to rule them all. I'm hoping for another 4 books in that clip. Alright, bye. Alright guys, the month is over, the one readathon to rule them all is over, and I'm here to tell you about the books that I read during the readathon. I had a lot of high hopes going into the readathon. If you missed my TBR, I will link it for you, but I had 4 books on that TBR, and unfortunately, I only ended up reading 2 of the 4 books that I'd wanted to read. And honestly, looking back at my TBR, I feel like it was a little ambitious because 2 of those 4 books were like over 800 pages. So I don't know why I thought I was going to be able to read that much in just a week. Or technically 9 days. Anyways, the first book that I finished during the readathon was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. which is the first book in the Strange the Dreamer duology. I mostly listened to this on audiobook, which I actually purchased myself using an Audible credit, and I also own a hardcover edition of this that I paged through a little bit while I was reading. Obviously, this is one of my favorite books because I own it in multiple formats. This was a reread for me, and the main reason I was reading it was just because it was the Ravenclaw House book, which means it was one of the prompts for the readathon. And me being a Ravenclaw co-host and Strange the Dreamer being one of my favorite books that I read last year, I thought it was a great idea to reread it. And I'm not saying that it wasn't a great idea, but my reading experience this time around wasn't quite as good as the first time, and I only gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. If you don't know, I am someone who gives a book a new rating each time I read it. I like to think of my ratings as representing my experience reading that book in that moment. And so while I love Strange the Dreamer and I still think of it as a 5-star book because that's what it was the first time that I read it, my experience reading it during the readathon was only a 4-star reading experience. And I think that's because the book was still fairly fresh on my mind since the last time I had read it. But also, I think I have learned that rereading during a readathon is like not the greatest idea for me, because the whole time I was reading Strange the Dreamer, part of me was enjoying it, but part of me was just anxious and stressed about getting it done so that I could move on and read other things for the readathon. And that really impacted my reading experience and made me not enjoy it as much as I had enjoyed it the first time. Let me back up a little bit. Strange the Dreamer, if you haven't heard of it, is a YA high fantasy book. The main character is Laszlo Strange, and he is a dreamer. He is someone who lives in his head a little bit. He's an orphan and he works in a library. His whole life he's been obsessed with this city called Weep, except that's not actually the name of the city. The city had a name, but it was magically erased from everybody's minds. And Laszlo remembers the moment that the name of this lost city was wiped from his brain, and it has turned it into a bit of an obsession for him. While most people have forgotten that the city even exists, Laszlo has not, and one day a delegation from the city shows up and they are looking for volunteers of scientists and other talented people to come back to their city to help them solve a problem that they have. I really love the story in this book and in this duology. I think Laini Taylor is wildly creative. Her stories are always very unique and different from anything else that I've ever read. Her writing style is gorgeous. It is a little on the flowery side, which is a complaint that some people have, but I love it so much, especially when I listen to it on audiobook, which is what I did this time. I had previously listened to the second book, the sequel, on audio, but I hadn't listened to the first one, and so for this reread, I decided to listen to it. And I'm so glad that I did. It's narrated by Steve West, and he is one of my all-time favorite narrators. He's very talented, and anytime I see his name on an audiobook, I immediately want to listen to it. Anyways, I don't think I have too much more to say about this book. I could probably gush about it forever, but the reality is that I didn't enjoy it as much on reread as I did the first time, but I really think a lot of that had to do with my circumstances of reading it during a readathon and being impatient and wanting to read other things that I had on my TBR that inevitably I didn't get to. And then the next book, the last one that I finished for the month, is honestly my favorite book of the month. That was Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. This is the third and final book in the Farseer trilogy, which is the first series in her larger Realm of the Elderlings series, which I am very excited to be getting to. Like I said, this was my favorite from the month. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. Technically, this was also a reread, but I originally read this trilogy like 10 years ago, and I really didn't remember a lot of it, so I didn't have the same rereading experience where I just wanted to get it over with. I was instead very much engrossed in the story, and I had so much fun reading this. I also listened to this mostly on audio, which I accessed through the app Scribd, but I also own an ebook copy of it, and I occasionally reference that as well. I also really like the narrator of this series, and that is Paul Bomer. I have listened to a lot of the whole trilogy, and I think he is really talented. I am also planning to film a couple of series videos about this trilogy. I'm planning a completely spoiler-free review of the trilogy as a whole, as well as a spoiler-filled series chat. I guess instead of a book chat, it's a series chat because it's going to be about the trilogy as a whole. So if you are interested in checking out this trilogy, or if you're already a fan of this trilogy, hopefully that's something you'll be excited about. Anyways, this is an adult high fantasy book. It's the third book in a trilogy, so obviously I can't say too much about the plot, but I do have some spoiler-free thoughts. This series as a whole has been fairly slow-moving. It's very character-focused. The series really focuses on the main character, Fitz Chivalry. He is the bastard son of Prince Chivalry, who was at one point next in line for the throne, but once it was discovered that he had a bastard, he actually stepped down from that position and gave up the throne. And that all happens early in the first book. It's part of the setup. This book started out super emotional from the very get-go for me, which I honestly hadn't been expecting because it is the last book in a trilogy. I was expecting the end of the trilogy to be emotional, which, don't get me wrong, the end of the series was also very emotional, but the opening of this book, like the first, I don't know, 4 or 5 chapters, I cried so much. There were just things from the end of the second book that were being realized that really emotionally affected me, and I hadn't expected that going into the book. As I mentioned, the series tends to be pretty slow moving because it's very character focused. The first 2 books you kind of just follow Fitz along on his life and see and experience the things that are happening to him. But this last book felt like it had a lot more purpose to me because, as the title suggests, there is a quest involved. There is an objective that Fitz is trying to accomplish through the book. And so the pacing was a lot better, a lot faster compared to the first 2 books. And then the ending was what I thought was a really good ending. It was a bittersweet ending, and that's the kind of ending that I enjoy reading. And I just thought that everything got wrapped up really well. A lot of my questions were answered, although there are some things that I definitely would like more information about, but that's why there are more books and series in this world. I cried a lot at the end of this book. This whole book, I just was kind of an emotional mess. After spending 3 books with these characters, they just mean so much to me, and I was so emotionally attached to them, and honestly, so many terrible things happened to them in this book, and it just broke my heart to see my beloved characters go through the things that they had to go through in this last book. This book honestly gave me a little bit of a book hangover, which I haven't had in a little while, but I just could not stop thinking about these characters for like a week after I finished this book. I just kept going back to the ending in my head and just feeling all of the emotions that I had. And the book just left me with a little bit of like a haunting feeling. And it was just so good. I loved it so much. As I mentioned, this trilogy was a reread for me. I read them like 10 years ago, but I had never continued on into the rest of the Realm of the Elderling series. And the purpose of this reread was because I wanted to read the rest of the Realm of the Elderlings. So I do plan to continue on in the larger series. So the way the series works is this first trilogy is about Fitz. And then there's another trilogy called The Life Ship Traders that is not about Fitz. And then there's a Fitz trilogy, and then I think you're supposed to read another trilogy that is not about Fitz. And then I think there's a quartet that's about Fitz. Anyways, basically, there are some things that are about Fitz and some things that aren't. I'm not gonna lie, part of me is very tempted to just jump to the next Fitz books, but most people who are big fans of the series really encourage you not to do that because the next Fitz series spoils some of the Life Ship Traders series, and even the author herself encourages you to read them in publication order, which means Life Ship Traders is next. So even though I'm gonna miss Fitz and the other characters from this book, and I want to get back to them as soon as possible, I am going to read the Life Ship Traders next. Alright guys, those are all of the books that I read in the month of November. If you have read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them down in the comment section. And tell me what your favorite book that you read in the month of November was. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.